For a majority of Americans, it makes sense to eliminate that mortgage faster, but does it really make sense financially? Today's video, we're going to be breaking down exactly that, where you can get rid of a lot of money woes if you're paying down your mortgage or if you're deciding to pay down your mortgage. And I'm also going to show you exactly what I'm doing with our mortgage to really make the most of it. Like I said, a lot of people do want to pay their mortgage off early, but does it make the most financial sense? I see people that are putting excess money into their mortgage, making principal payments, doubling up on payments every single year. And of course, the first one of this, if you have a high interest debt, it is going to be most beneficial. And again, following Dave Ramsey's baby steps to pay off that high interest debt before you ever put an extra penny on your mortgage makes a big difference. When you start looking at loans, when you start looking at credit cards, when you look at anything that is a higher interest rate essentially than your mortgage, it is going to be very beneficial for not only your well-being, but also mathematically to crush out that debt and eliminate it in comparison to what we're seeing on mortgage rates, where even right now mortgage rates are running about 7%. Most of the high interest debt is yielding about 22 to 30% interest, which is kind of crazy to think when you look at the disparity. Now, second part of this, if you're not planning to stay in your home for the long term. So a majority of Americans live in their house about 7 years. That is about the average, which means essentially if you're putting a lot more money into your house, you might be very short term, almost investing it in the house, building maybe a little bit of equity. But overall, if you're doing it very short term, which means usually staying about a year, maybe two, especially if you're doing a 30-year mortgage, is chances are you're not going to touch enough of that principal by putting it down, because most of what you're putting down is essentially going to be eaten up, especially if you don't have large chunks to put down there. If you don't plan to stay in your home for at least 10 years, it would be more beneficial to put money into the stock market versus using those funds to actually pay down the mortgage. Now, when you start looking at a big picture and looking at your house, this is really the big part. Do I invest or do I pay off my house? Again, when you start thinking of the Dave Ramsey philosophy, putting 15% into retirement and then putting the rest to really pay down the house. Now, traditionally, this works mathematically. It doesn't make a lot of sense, especially if you are behind on your retirement savings. If you're behind the average, putting more money into an investment account can make a really big difference. For majority of us, if you look at 2021, 2022, where interest rates were incredibly low, almost 64% of Americans refinanced to a much lower rate, which means paying it off versus investing. For me personally, mathematically, it makes a much wiser sense to go ahead and invest those funds, again, going against the teachings of Dave Ramsey. But overall, when I think about what I can get returns in the S&P 500, average returns in the S&P 500 have been roughly 10%. I have a mortgage that's at 2.5%, so I can make 7.5%. Again, it's not going to be guaranteed and it's not going to be every year, but I can gain 7.5% by putting it into essentially an investment account, growing it much faster, and even taking money out of that investment account to go ahead and pay off the mortgage makes sense. Again, mathematically, when you start looking big picture, it makes sense to invest versus putting money towards the mortgage. Now, of course, there is a piece in there, the psychological part of having the free and clear house that a lot of people do focus on. However, if you have enough money, again, in that investment account to pay it off, there's going to hit a date. And that's exactly what I did. Was I set a date of when I turned 50, my 50th birthday, what I have in that essentially my investment account, I am going to put onto the mortgage, which at this point will be significantly more than enough to pay it off. The rest that I'm keeping in there, I'm just going to continue to stockpile until we actually get to the point of having the free and clear mortgage and being fully retired. Now, of course, never put money towards your mortgage if you do not have that emergency fund. This is the financial basics. This is the financial fundamentals. When you start getting into an emergency fund, you need 3 to 6 months of a fully funded emergency fund at a minimum before a dollar even goes into paying off that mortgage. Now, of course, when it comes to a mortgage, if you need money, it is incredibly difficult and time consuming if you're remortgaging to, let's say, do cash out. If you're doing a home equity product where you're pulling cash out with the equity, it can take 30, 60 days for a majority of lenders, if not longer, to actually get the money, which is the reason why an emergency fund is so vital. And of course, when it comes to baby steps, that is really the big part that you do want to focus on. Now, of course, additionally with the mortgage is you could take a tax deduction when you start looking at the itemization of your taxes. And of course, consult a tax advisor to know exactly what you do qualify for. If you can take a standardized deduction, you won't qualify for the mortgage interest, but if you are itemizing your taxes, you can actually deduct this as well, which is a little caveat to have. And of course, guys, if you do like the content I'm putting out, consider subscribing to the channel. Let's get into the rest of these. Now, of course, your interest rate is below the rate of inflation. This is another one where you have to think of where you're really at with your mortgage rate. For me, like I had said, I am at 2.5%. Right now, interest is about, I believe, 3.6. So of course, Fed is trying to get a target or trying to move that down to 2%. Are they actually going to get there? I don't know exactly how long it's going to mean or how long it's honestly going to take. But focusing on the mortgage at a 2.5%, where I could even put money into a high yield savings accounts or CDs and get a guaranteed 5% return for those. Again, mathematically doesn't make a lot of sense to go ahead and throw those in. And of course, if you have other financial goals, again, this might be a bigger priority. It might be something that actually replace whether it is going for kids' college, replacing an older car that you're going to have to, taking care of your aging parents, which I know a lot of us have to, makes a big difference, guys. Not putting that extra money that you could essentially use financially to better your life or better, your family's life, your kids' life, taking care of college, because again, the mortgage is going to be there and hopefully you got a pretty good rate on there. Now, of course, keeping money liquid. We talked about this a little bit with the emergency fund. Keeping money liquid is very, very important. And unfortunately, a lot of people that I see might have a very nice income. However, they are very cash flow poor, which means a majority of the income that is coming out is already spoken for, meaning they actually don't have liquid. If you're paying off, again, extra money towards your house, you have to sell the house, you have to take out a home equity, you got to refinance. It doesn't give you easy access to your money. So not only above and beyond that emergency fund, but also having some cash like kind of set aside, that is going to be the liquid money you kind of need for a month to month without putting it into that account. Now, of course, when you think about paying off your mortgage, a lot of people think that it's going to have a huge impact on the credit score, that paying off a fixed loan, paying off an installment loan, overall debt to income ratios will get a little bit better, but your credit score might take a slight hit if you pay it down or do pay it off. And of course, keeping your mortgage current is always going to be the biggest benefactor, but you'll get to a point where you no longer need it because essentially you don't need a credit score. And that is a theory that a lot of people really can't wrap their heads around. If you follow, George Kamal or a few other people that do not believe in credit scores, don't use really credit at all, don't borrow, don't anything like that, you can actually get by for a lot of different things when it comes to not having a credit score in its entirety. I know it's kind of a very right side or right wing, whatever you want to call it, different philosophy of seeing it, but ultimately you don't need it. Now, if you're really thinking about paying off that mortgage early, you can easily afford to make monthly payments. That might be the point where, again, all of the other things that we've kind of talked about that you'd want to focus on long before you do get into paying off the mortgage. When it gets into pretty much a low interest rate mortgage, just like we've seen with Warren Buffett and a few other ones that will literally carry a mortgage. If it's 30-year mortgage, they will carry it for 30 years because they know there's a bigger opportunity out there that is waiting for them. And also make sure you do not have a prepayment penalty. Now, we don't see this very often, but sometimes if you're paying your mortgage ahead of schedule, and if you even pay it off years before, some institutions do have a prepayment penalty that is going to be assessed when you do pay that off. So make sure you know the details of the mortgage before you're signing those paperwork. But all right, guys, so that is going to do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. And as always, thank you guys for watching.